It would be an understatement to say that the Electronics Entertainment Expo, or better known as E3, was the gaming event for big reveals each year. A yearly summer event every gamer looked forward to, E3 will go down in history for the impact it left on the industry. From the start of many blockbuster franchises to infamous gaming moments,
so here's this giant enemy crab.
E3 was legendary for bringing in the best of the best in game news. 1995 was a pivotal year in games. The fifth generation was underway, 3D graphics with shading and textures were becoming possible in a home console, and CD-ROMs were all the rage. Looking at you, Nintendo. With the likes of the 3DO and the Atari Jaguar already out, the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation to launch this year, and Nintendo 64 to launch the next year, it's undeniable that there is no time like 1995 to start a revolutionary show. E3 began life on May 11 in 1995 as an event focused specifically on the video games industry. Created by the ESA, it was a yearly conference where games publishers, developers, and console manufacturers could mingle far away from the more generalized and often more chaotic tech trade shows such as CES. Taking place at the Los Angeles Convention Center, the early years of E3 were often focused on the business side of video games. Sure, there were tons of new games and hardware reveals, but alongside these were more than a fair share of business analytics, spreadsheets, and dry presentations. Speaking of dry, Sega's cash reserves. Sega! E3 was Sega's foray into the fifth generation console market, and with it, a tumultuous time for Sega. By 1995, Sega had been struggling to keep its 16-bit audience's attention. While the Genesis proved worthy competition to the Nintendo-dominated market, sales were declining, technology was moving forward, and fierce competition was on the horizon. Stopgaps in Sega's hardware in the form of Genesis warts, such as the Sega CD and 32X, failed to move the needle in any significant way.
You are approaching Saturn.
But are you ready for the future?
Introducing Sega Saturn.
Released in November the prior year in Japan, around the same time as the 32X in America, the Saturn was Sega's primary focus at E3 95. Touting the same dual Hitachi SH2 CPUs as the 32X, albeit clocked much higher, and not one but two video display processors known as VDP-1 and VDP-2, the Saturn was set to take Sega into the 3D era. This configuration was essentially duct taped together last minute to compete with Sony PlayStation's impressive 3D showings. This made the Saturn notoriously difficult to work with, and while it was a 2D powerhouse in the right hands, the 3D capabilities were less than stellar. To make matters worse, then Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske went on stage to drop the bomb that Saturn will be priced at $399.
Our retail price is between $399 and $449.
Be bundled with the then impressive arcade conversion Virtua Fighter and would be available that day, pushing the release day up to May 11th from the originally planned Saturn Day, September 2nd. 30,000 units were delivered to retailers Toys R Us and Electronics Boutique, among others, while some retailers such as Best Buy and Walmart were left without notice and decided to retaliate by not carrying the Saturn in their stores. While this release date change should have been exciting at the time, this ultimately turned out to be a poor decision and one of many that would spell out the death of the Sega Saturn and ultimately end Sega hardware as a whole. You'll get him next time, Sega! Sega had a huge presence at E3 95 and brought with it many notable titles, not only for the Saturn, but for the aging Genesis as well. Vector Man was Sega's answer to Nintendo and Rare's Donkey Kong Country. With the DK sequel showcasing at the same event, Sega wanted a piece of the digitized pie too. Running at a smooth 60 frames per second and showing off the capabilities of the Genesis, Vector Man would successfully reignite some declining Genesis interest, one ball at a time. Another late Genesis venture, developed in-house by Sega Technical Institute, or STI if they want to get tested, the graphically distinct beat-em-up Comic Zone brought players directly into the pages of a comic book story, showing that Sega's 16-bit Genesis still had some life left in it. To be released a few months after its E3 debut on August 2nd, 1995, Comic Zone is carried by its visual style, which is about as 90s as it gets, I might add, with the gameplay leaving a little to be desired. The bread and butter of Sega's offerings this year were the games for its brand new Saturn hardware. Legendary developer Sega AM2 brought with them 2 arcade-to-home conversions and Saturn launch titles, Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter. The Saturn port of Virtua Fighter was as close to bringing home the Model 1 classic arcade game as you could get in 1995. Virtua Fighter featured the same 30 FPS gameplay as the arcade original and was included as a pack-in title. Daytona USA was a smash hit when it came to arcades the prior year. Powered by the Sega Model 2 arcade board, Daytona USA was also a graphical powerhouse delivering a stunning presentation at 60 frames per second. For the Saturn, then, Daytona USA needed to be scaled back greatly to run on the much less powerful hardware. Textures take a notable hit, resolution is scaled back, and now the game is dropped to 20 FPS. Despite all of these concessions, an arcade game of this caliber running on home console hardware was still mind-blowing. Panzer Dragoon will always be a standout title for the Saturn. Who could ignore the pseudo-reflections in the opening level and the sense of freedom in a rail shooter allowing you to rotate as you progress? Team Andromeda would continue to push the Saturn in unique ways, and Panzer Dragoon showed what the Saturn was capable of in the right hands. Overall, E3 1995 for Sega was chock full of news and announcements, but several blunders and miscalculations during this time, driven by a disconnect between Sega of America and Sega of Japan, meant that the very first E3 marked the start of a long struggle for Sega's hardware ventures. Newcomer to the video game console market, Sony came to E3 1995 acting like total badasses. E3 95 ushered in an era where Sony would dominate hardware sales time and time again. A great lineup of games showcasing the power of PlayStation and ruthless business tactics cemented Sony as a longtime competitor in gaming. Previously working with Nintendo to bring a CD-based console, the PlayStation, to market, Nintendo got cold feet at the 11th hour and ghosted Sony, deciding to work with Philips and create the CDI, which turned out to be just awful.
Sorry, Zelda. Not enough rubies. You'll have to wipe out a few more gorillas to get that.
Yikes. Back to little Sony with a big console dream, the PlayStation continued development and would release December 3rd, 1994 in Japan, and be set to release September 9th, 1995, just 1 week after the then planned Saturn launch in the US. The PlayStation was looking like an impressive machine capable of 3D graphics matching or beating the Saturn. Sony's machine boasted an R3000 CPU clocked at a whopping 33.86 MHz and was used to calculate complex 3D visuals. The separate GPU calculated 2D polygons, textures, and lighting. The PS1, like the Saturn, lacked perspective-correct texture mapping, causing warble in the textures of low-poly meshes. A measure to cut costs and increase speed, this became a defining PS1 visual staple. Sony took to the stage after Sega and had very similar talking points, such as PCs being too complex for simple plug-and-play gaming. The excitement of this keynote came when Sony called to the stage Steve Race to deliver this short presentation.
Some of you might actually want to know what that prize is. Since it's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles, I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
Ouch, right in the price point. Even without a bundled game, Sony now had the cheaper, more powerful console and tons of third-party support backing them up. Many popular arcade franchises made their console debut at E3 95. Sony relied heavily on third-party titles due to the lack of experience making games. The comparisons run deep with Saturn, as Ridge Racer and Tekken aim to give similar experiences to Daytona USA and Virtua Fighter. Sony's own Twisted Metal was shown this year, featuring arcade-style vehicular combat, a rocking soundtrack, edgy characters, and great 3D visuals. This is where a legendary Sony franchise was born. Sony absolutely stole the show for E3 1995, setting the stage for many generations of market dominance. The PlayStation brand is stronger than ever nearly 30 years later. Nintendo was leading the market around this time, with Super Nintendo receiving phenomenal support from first and third parties, their next big leap in the form of numbers. was looking to be even more powerful than the competition, while the Game Boy continued to enjoy a hazy green dominance in the handheld market. During their press conference, Nintendo revealed plans to delay the Nintendo 64, then called Ultra 64, from 1995 to April of 1996 over concerns of a lack of first-party software being ready at launch. The main focus this year for Nintendo was how to provide constant and unending headaches. The Virtual Boy. The red over existential black void visual technology that even Sega refused to use when approached by Reflection Technologies Inc. soon made their way into Game Boy inventor Gunpei Yokoi's possession. Positioned as Nintendo's next big 32-bit console, sitting somewhere between Super Nintendo and Game Boy in terms of marketing and visuals, the Virtual Boy was described as a stereoscopic 3D unit. The unit faced a lot of criticism and became one of Nintendo's biggest failures, being discontinued less than a year later with 700,000 units sold. A heavy showing of Super Nintendo, Virtual Boy, and Game Boy games this year kept Nintendo successful throughout another year without their next-gen console. Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest takes everything that made the first Donkey Kong Country work and improves on it. Visually stunning at the time, albeit very similar to its predecessor, Diddy's Conquest helped keep the Super Nintendo feeling fresh while consumers waited through the delay of the Ultra 64. Rare took the same technology of the Donkey Kong Country games and turned it into a high-speed arcade fighting game. With a visually stunning SNES port, Killer Instinct competed with the likes of Virtua Fighter and Tekken while running on much less capable hardware. A sequel to Mother on the NES and developed by Kirby creator HAL Laboratories for the Super Nintendo, Earthbound is a unique take on the turn-based RPG genre that saw much popularity in this era. Being a big focus for Nintendo this year and acting as a stopgap between SNES and Ultra 64, many Virtual Boy games and demos were at the show. Galactic Pinball was a basic pinball game where the gimmick is you can see the depth of the pinball as it moves around the table. A great showcase of the technology, Tellero Boxer is a game where you see the punches coming directly at you and takes place from the player's perspective. Virtual Boy Wario Land is considered by most to be the best Virtual Boy game ever made. While a fun and novel use of 3D was presented in this game, it's actually just a phenomenal platformer underneath. A fairly faithful adaptation of the Donkey Kong Country style into a new portable adventure, Donkey Kong Land did for Donkey Kong what the Mario Land series did for Mario. Killer Instinct was shown also running on the Game Boy, and it was impressive to see the arcade hit crunched down to portable form. A strong focus on what made the Super Nintendo and Game Boy so great, with a huge deluge of Virtual Boy news, games, and announcements, meant Nintendo could stay successful in another year without a next-gen box, even with Sega and Sony at each other's throats. The 3DO was one of the earliest examples of a 5th-generation console, doing its best to output textured 3D visuals at a playable frame rate. I said it's doing its best, I didn't say it was good. The 3DO failed to make a big commercial splash, and with a launch price of $699, it was clear competitors would outmatch them in every way. So then, during their keynote, 3DO had a lot to say about their upcoming M2 platform, showcasing visuals representative of its capabilities, not necessarily running on this hardware. 3DO would eventually cancel this console and sell off the M2 rights. Following this, 3DO would fizzle out of the industry over the course of the 90s. Atari had a huge presence at the show, pushing many Jaguar and Jaguar CD games for what was ultimately a failing console. Interestingly, they also brought with them the Atari Jaguar VR, a canceled VR headset that was due to be out that year. Apparently, Nintendo and Atari were smoking the same stuff. While I could talk forever about every third-party game and publisher making an appearance at E3 1995, I thought I'd take a minute to highlight some major players at this show outside of the first-party keynotes. Beginning with Namco, who had a huge presence on the show floor and were clearly all in on Sony's fledgling console, Ridge Racer showed off just what this machine was capable of. While the arcade iteration ran at a blazing 60 frames per second, the developers had to settle for 30 frames per second on Sony's hardware. While modest today, this was a time when games very commonly ran at sub 20 frames per second, and the arcade experience couldn't often be matched at home. Ridge Racer was essentially developed from scratch for the PlayStation in a relatively short turnaround and faithfully replicated the arcade experience at the time. Next up, Tekken. When Virtua Fighter designer Seiichi Ishii left Sega to work for Namco, the vision for Tekken was intended to be Virtua Fighter with textures and double the frame rate. The developers didn't stop there, however, with characters and controls being a huge focus in making Tekken a unique fighting game for arcades. When the PlayStation port was developed the next year, everything that made the arcade version great was kept for the PlayStation, including smooth 60 FPS gameplay and even full motion video. Squaresoft casually brought 2 huge RPGs to the show floor this year for Super Nintendo, where they had seen much success with earlier titles like Secret of Mana and the then recent Final Fantasy VI. Releasing just months after the show, Squaresoft was pushing Chrono Trigger as their next big hit, and it went on to become one of the best RPGs ever made. Sharing many similarities with Secret of Mana, albeit not a game in the Mana series, Secret of Evermore was brought to the show as a Western-only RPG. Capcom was known at this time for Mega Man and Street Fighter II, but would bring a huge new title to E3 and the next gen. Resident Evil cleverly showed off an impressive aesthetic on the PS1. 3D models were used for characters and enemies, while the backgrounds were bitmaps pre-rendered out from much higher quality 3D assets. This gave the impression of a very detailed world with 3D visuals. Nearly 30 years ago, video games as we knew them would see a shift in not only how we play them or how they're stored or what they looked like, but also how companies would present their hard work before launch. With events like Summer Games Fest and the Game Awards, as well as showcases like the Nintendo Direct and the Sony State of Play, fleeting moments still feel like the E3 of yesterday. Nothing will ever match the energy and excitement of big onstage presentations, a show floor full of demos and kiosks, and bombs like
$2.99.
This is only the beginning of my E3 retrospectives, as there's still plenty more years of the show to cover in the future. That's it for me this time though. Thanks for watching.